Well, greetings everybody, and welcome here to the Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show. This is a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So, we're back here with my mini-series that we're doing for this week. Started on Monday. We are now into day 5, the Friday, and we are going to be talking about one of the big 6. So the big 6 really are the 6 progressive rock bands that are called the big 6. I think primarily because they are pioneers of this genre. They have had huge influence on the music in this genre and are considered to be the bands that most people on this who follow progressive rock go to. They're the go-to bands, I guess, if you want. So they came out in 1967 through 1970. During that period, all 6 bands came out. They're British. Personally, I think Rush should be in here, but that's just me. Even though they're not really British and they came out later than this, they don't really fit into the genre. At first, when I heard the Big 6, I thought, how can they not have Rush in there? Are you kidding me? I was kind of miffed about it, but then I began to understand why these 6 bands are in there. I probably would have put Gentle Giant in there too. If you're going to put King Crimson in there, I think Gentle Giant belongs in there, but at any rate, it's just opinions, and these are the ones that people have come to think of that way. So personally, what we're going to do today is we're just going to talk about not talk about them all, because we've done 4 episodes already. If you want to watch, the first one was on Jethro Tull, then I did one on Emerson, Lake and Palmer, I then did one on King Crimson, and then Pink Floyd, and now this is day 5. We're doing Genesis. Genesis, a lot of people consider Genesis not only the best of all the prog bands, the most influential, the most well-liked, some of the greatest progressive rock stuff written, and many bands have imitated them. Many bands I like have imitated them. So I'm not going to argue that point. I do like them a lot. They are one of my favorite bands, number 3 actually, to be honest. And I really think this band put out a string of unrivaled studio albums, like one after another. I don't think anybody has that run of albums. Some of them, not too far off though, at least for me, because some of them, like King Crimson and Pink Floyd, I'm still kind of discovering their, you'll have to excuse me for a second, I'm still discovering their discography, so we won't be talking too much about their live albums, because I find with most of them, King Crimson, yes, I'm trying to think, those 2 bands for certain put out a ton of live albums. King Crimson, and yes, for sure, those 2 put out a ton of live albums. You could make one every year for them. And it makes this, it stands to reason when you think about it. It's because a lot of these bands are still touring and playing music. So while you're touring and playing music, why not record it? And if it's good enough, seems good enough, hey, we'll release it as a live album, and people buy it up. So it's free money. Why not take it? So anyways, on with the show, as they say. So Genesis came out in 1968 or so. They released an album in 1969 called From Genesis to Revelations. I don't really count that as a Genesis album, although it's counted in the count because they've done 15 studio albums, and it was the first one. Doesn't really sound like Genesis at all to me. I've listened to it. It's got a very poppy kind of 60-ish sound, very different. They didn't really discover their music until Trespass, which was the next album. Then they moved up into what I call Genesis material, and had a nice run of 7 or 8 albums. Maybe it was even 9 albums, and some people might count Duke in there too, so maybe it could be as many as 10 albums before they started into the really getting heavily into pop music. So Genesis, best album, not my favorite, not even on my top 5 favorites, but I think most people recognize this as their best album. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It's a double album, lots of really classic Genesis stuff on here, lots of really good stuff on here. I can see why people feel this way. To me, it has a bit of an outlier. It kind of doesn't sound like it belongs in that run of albums. So you go Trespass, Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. They all kind of sound similar, just a little bit more on each of them. Then you go to Trick of the Tail, which Gabriel's gone, but it doesn't sound, to me, Trick of the Tail sounds very similar to Selling England by the Pound, and then Wind in the Wuthering is a little bit similar to that, but not as big. And then And You and I starts to move away from it a bit, but this doesn't really sound like those albums. It's kind of on its own, on the outlier, and that's why people think maybe it's the greatest of their albums. I'm not going to argue with it. It definitely has a lot of really strong stuff on it. Their last album was called, if I'm correct, it's called Calling All Stations, featuring Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, and the newly acquired, was his name? Damn, I cannot remember. Ron Wilson. Okay, or is it Ron Wilson? Ray Wilson, sorry. Ron Wilson was a hockey player, sorry. Yeah, Ray Wilson did the vocals on that. Not too, sounded quite a bit like Gabriel in a lot of ways. I just don't think the album was that great. I haven't really owned it or listened to it a lot, so it's fair to give it a negative judgment without having done that. So eventually I will get it and play it and see how I feel about it regularly rather than just a once off. So that was their last album, which came out, I believe, in 1997. This one was the last by Gabriel, which came out in 1974. What else? Their classic eras, pretty much considered from Trespass to, and then there were three. Some people may go a little further to Duke, or maybe even a little further than that, I don't know, or maybe they may go all the way back, but I just think that that's their classic era, when they were most influential and are still having a lot of influence. Their status is, of course, retired. They decided to retire because of Phil's health, and so that prayed for, hopeful people praying every day for Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett to come back to the classic lineup and for them to do something. Well, with Phil's status, I don't really see that happening. It's unfortunate. And Peter Gabriel, the thoughtful type of person he is, he was backstage at their last concert and didn't come out because he didn't want it to be about him and a possible reunion again. He wanted to let them have their final hurrah without influence, and to me that's class. And maybe Genesis will never, maybe you cannot ever go back with some bands. This is the same kind of well, it's not the same kind of scenario that you get with Pink Floyd, but it's, the results are the same. You're not going to get it to happen for different reasons, you know. So anyways, they released 15 albums as well, 15 studio albums. As I said, we won't be talking about the live albums. So the members of this band lie somewhere between the Pink Floyd and ELP extreme and the extreme of Jethro Tull, Yes, and King Crimson. So there's, I think, about 6 or 7 members, maybe as many as 10 here. Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Peter Gabriel, Phil Collins, and Steve Hackett. Those are considered the classic members of the band. When they were all together making albums, they made the best, most memorable albums. I think all exceptionally well gifted instrumental and musicianship. You also had Anthony Phillips, Chris Stewart, and John Silver, and John Mayall, who were also, well, the last three, Chris Stewart, John Silver, John Mayall, were all previous drummers to Phil Collins. John Mayhew also played drums on Trespass. He wasn't bad, but he's clearly not in the same league as Phil Collins, who came on and took that, and then they excelled with that part on. You also had Mike Barnard, and there was one other, I can't find him. Mike Barnard, he was just a previous musician to the Trespass era. I don't know that he was on Genesis and Revelations. He may have been a musician that was with the band before they did any recordings I'm not 100% sure there. And then, of course, you have Ray Wilson, who was the singer who took over from Phil Collins when he was no longer able to sing with the band, or no longer desired to sing with the band, whichever the case may be. So this band has long been one of my favorites. To me, they just produced one great album after another. It seemed like an endless string until they hit a brick wall with the Duke, and then that was pretty much it. Although I will say this, I do enjoy some of the Phil Collins studio stuff, even though some of the Genesis stuff that came out after that does sound like his stuff quite a bit. I think that he's incorrectly maligned for this, I think, and I'm going to say this because I've heard this many times, people saying that, oh, they just sound like Phil Collins, he had too much influence. Well, he had the influence, yes, but it wasn't his decision. Clearly Tony Banks is in charge of that band and has been since Peter's leaving, and if they sound it like Phil Collins, it's because he wanted to sound that way, because he's seen how much success Phil Collins was having, and he, like so many people in the world, like money. That's not a bad thing. But he decided, well, if we sound like Phil, maybe we'll make more money, and I'm thinking that's what happened. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. They did put out some of their earlier albums weren't too bad. Like, when I say earlier, the earlier stuff from that came out after their prog era and the end of 70s. So, like Duke, Genesis self-titled album, and Abacab are all really good albums. I don't mind them. Self-titled one, not so much so, but the other two definitely I like. The stuff after that is hit and miss. There's some good stuff on some of it, and some terrible stuff on some of it. Some of their albums are absolutely beyond my grasp, but those earlier ones, Duke, I'm not a big fan of Duke, but I do like Abacab quite a bit. And the other self-titled Genesis album, the one with all of the yellow pieces that fit into block areas, that album isn't too bad either. And there's a few others, like some people don't like Let's Dance or whatever it's called. There are some tracks on that I even like. So, anyways, there you have it. Genesis, one of the big six prog bands. Please make any comments you have about anything I've said or anything that you want to say. Just remember, these are only my own opinions. They're not necessarily correct opinions. I just talk about music as I see it, and people can correct me. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not an encyclopedia. I'm definitely not the one from Trunkcore, that's for sure. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. It's much appreciated. And we'll be back with the final episode tomorrow morning, which leaves only one band, right? So we'll see you then. Take care.